Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
I grew up in a very tight-knit family. My family, my extended family, not just my immediate family, my extended family on my dad's side for over 50, 60 years, I think, has gotten together at my grandfather's house. And I'm talking like 200 people, right? Cousins. My grandfather had like 7 brothers and sisters, and all their kids and grandkids would get together once a year over a holiday weekend at the end of summer for 2 days and hang out together and sing songs around a campfire. It's kind of corny stuff, right? But we like a very tight-knit family. Very much, like no fights happened. It was very close, tight-knit, and amazing family that I grew up in. And then in the last couple of years, probably in the last, I'd say 5 to 7 years, the families all of a sudden started to break apart. Some of the people in Ohio don't get along with some of the people in Pennsylvania, who don't get along with some of the people in Oklahoma, because we all come in together for these big reunions, right? And all of a sudden, within the last year, actually, the family has started to break apart because they can't seem to see eye to eye. Now, they agree politically most of the time. They agree philosophically. They agree religiously. And yet, there's a lot of tension and a lot of fracturing in my extended family. And I've been racking my brain to try to figure out what's going on because I can't seem to find out why there's so many differences. And this family that's been close-knit for almost 60 years is starting to break apart. Now, this is a natural atrophy that happens with families. I think things just naturally go through their cycles. My grandfather's generation, I think, has all passed away. I think there's a few of the in-laws still alive, but most of that generation's passed away. And so the next generation down and the one below that doesn't have the same feelings around getting together as maybe my grandfather's generation did. And then I ran into a Washington Post article recently. It was talking about this idea of how the United States has very different subcultures, and not just the United States, all of North America has different subcultures within it. And as I began to read this article, I realized it was an excerpt from a book. So I instantly ordered the book, right? Got it here. It sat on our shelves for a couple weeks. Antonia picks it up. She starts reading through it, tells me about it. We start reading it together, and now all of a sudden, I'm starting to realize why my family, there's probably other factors too, but one of the big keys of why my family is starting to break apart at this point, or starting to have a lot of tension to where it's having these different factions break away and create their own little clusters together. So we thought we could use that as a launching pad, my story about my family, to talk about this really cool book that's a map and model of different people groups here in the United States and unpack some of this. And it might really be something interesting for you, whether you live in the United States or not. Now, this is going to be a very North American-centric podcast, but even if you're from another country overseas, outside of North America, we believe that this conversation will be very insightful for you to get a sense of the cultures that are at play here in the United States and North America that probably impact you, at least in the media that we export.
And what's so interesting about using your family as a launching pad for all of this is, like you said, in almost every way, they seem to have the same culture. They're politically aligned. They're religiously aligned. They have very similar philosophies in the world. And they're all from the position of me, who I'm from the West Coast. They all seem to be from the Midwest or, an Eastern states. So it feels like the culture should be the same. And so when we were talking about what is going on here, like, is it because social media makes it so that everybody can keep in touch with each other? Or like, is it just a new world, or what's happening here? And like you mentioned, there is some natural atrophy. But after we read this book, we went, that has got to be a big node in the system, like a big one. So the book that Joel is referencing is a book called American Nations by Colin Woodard. And the theory behind this book is that there are 11 distinct nations in North America occupying portions of Mexico also and Canada as well, but primarily centered in the United States. There are these 11 nations that have extraordinary influence over the variety of cultures that are seen in the United States, in Canada, and northern parts of Mexico. Now, what's so interesting about this is that, and he begins the book by referencing a lot of political rhetoric that talk about getting the United States in particular, but getting America back to its roots, back to a unified place where we have shared values, shared goals, shared interests. Like we got to get back to that place where are all on the same page. And his argument is that these nations within this country and Canada and northern parts of Mexico, we've never had a time period where we weren't divided. We've always been divided from the very beginning. There was never a glorious sort of golden age of unification. Maybe time periods where big wars were being fought, like everybody'd sort of pitch in and fight the common enemy. But with the exception of time periods where we had these uneasy alliances in order to fight common enemies, we were built on these different cultures basically at war with each other. And sometimes they were actually in physical wars with each other, like in the Civil War. So breaking down these different cultures as he talks about them, and of course we're going to fillet them out, but talking about these different cultures almost becomes like a typology system for people in the United States and Canada and in the northern part of Mexico. It becomes almost like a typology system, not based on individual personality type, but based on these strong cultural influences that make up a big part of our life philosophy.
And if you live somewhere in the United States and you tend to not get along with the people around you, or they just seem so different than you, you're probably living among a different nation than how you're wired, right? So, and the other thing about this too, he makes a really good distinction in this book when he starts out, the difference between a nation and a state. So state, or estates here in the United States, these are the border lines that are drawn, the border between Canada and the United States, or between Mexico and the United States, or between the actual states in the United States. And this happens, Europe, Africa, Australia, Asia. There's every area has obviously hand-drawn border lines, right, that we observe politically and economically. But what nations are, these are people groups, and they actually reach across borders. They don't obey borders at all. Somebody that, for example, lives near the border in Canada and United States, they probably share a very similar culture, even though they're across a border from each other, a political border, for example. So these nations exist, and they don't have any respect for the state lines or the country lines that are the defining elements of an actual political boundary.
Right. And states can have multiple nations within it. So a single state, again, those territory lines are rather arbitrary when it comes to the cultures that spring up around them. And a big part of the etymology of how these nations were born is based on the settlers who came and settled them originally. And so in the book, even in the introduction, he mentions, well, that's kind of the premise of the entire book, is the question, can nations founded centuries ago really have maintained the distinct identities to the present day based on who originally settled them? And he goes into some pretty compelling information and research that's been done that indicates that even as few as a dozen settlers, like original settlers of an area, can maintain cultural roots over long amounts of time, primarily because once they've established it, the other people that immigrate to those cultural places, as opposed to just bringing their cultural influence, which of course does happen to some extent, but they actually end up acclimating to the culture that's already been settled. And so they're far more likely to be inducted into that culture and maintain it over time, even centuries, than they are to dramatically change it. And as Joel mentioned, if you kind of don't get along with the people around you, it could be that you have a very different culture or a nation that you identify with. And if you've relocated, maybe moved across the United States to a place that just felt more like home to you, it might not just be the region, like the physical beauty of the place or maybe the amenities, but you might have been actually moving towards this culture. There's a book he references, I think it's called The Big Sorting. I could be wrong on that one. I'll probably have to reference it really quick. But it's called The Big Sort. That's right. And it's basically that especially in North America, where we have the ability to have, quite a bit of freedom to move wherever we want to. We can relocate, we can find jobs online easily or easier than it used to be maybe 100 years ago. If we want to move across the United States, that's a very doable thing in the modern world. as opposed to, time periods in the past where that would have been an extraordinary undertaking. And so this idea of the big sort is that we're moving to places where we identify with those nations more. So if we were raised in a nation, a quote unquote nation, or cultural, sort of flavoring that isn't to our individual liking, we go find the nation we're the most aligned with and we go move there. And so we're even more sorting ourselves in North America into these distinct cultures. So that's kind of the premise of the concept, that we find these distinct nations within North America. We have a tendency to create a sorting by moving there. We are also very influenced by it as we grow up. We're not just born with it, but actually these are sort of socialized influences within us that really frame how we're going to experience the world and the lenses through which we experience a lot of reality. It's at least one big node. And it explains a lot of why we don't necessarily always get along with each other. And we have such varied, different, political rhetoric. And we have very different agendas. And sometimes we just can't understand people who occupy the quote unquote other side. So what's nice about this is it's in some way a really interesting diagnostic about why people approach the world the way that they do in the United States and Canada and Mexico. I keep saying United States and then I have to remind myself to say Canada and Mexico because it takes in those countries too. I'll just keep saying North America. It's one of the reasons why it's a really great way of indicating why there are so many different varied perspectives in North America, and a diagnostic around maybe sort of understanding that. And then maybe if we get really good at understanding it, there might be some prescriptive elements towards the end.
So in the book American Nations, the author Woodard goes through the actual book in the order that these nations sprung up, basically as they were founded or settled. But in the introduction, he goes through it in a different order. I think he kind of does it from more of a historical lens of what we've been told in North American, at least United States-centric schools of how things emerged, right? So he starts obviously with like the Massachusetts Bay founding. But in the book, when he gets into the actual chapters, he talks about the founding of these 11 nations. So let me go ahead and just list these down. And then this is in the order that they were founded. And then we'll go back through in kind of the order how he takes us through in the introduction. And we'll unpack each of those nations and some of the characteristics of them. And then at the end of this podcast, we're going to weave together some of our insights, some of our narrative. And then you can chime in too with your story and some of your insights that you're taking away from this as well. So these are the names of the 11 nations in the order that they were founded or settled. El Norte, New France, Tidewater, Yankeedom, New Netherlands, the Deep South, the Midlands, Greater Appalachia, the Left Coast, the Far West, and First Nation.
And he mentions that First Nation could also be considered the oldest and the newest nation, depending upon how you look at it. It's the part of Canada that honors a growing amount of influence from Indigenous population up in the, basically the portions of Canada that really you had to have, had your ancestors be living there for hundreds upon hundreds of years to be able to survive. And that, of course, was a nation before, European settlers and Spanish settlers came. But they've also been highly marginalized for a very long amount of time. And the First Nation people are getting a growing voice that is highly influential. And so he mentions that First Nation is both the oldest and the newest of the nations, depending upon how you look at it.
Yeah, and also Northern Alaska is part of that First Nation as well.
Right, exactly. So the order in which he takes them in the introduction, that's the direction we're going to go. And we're going to kind of mention them one at a time and talk a little bit about their characteristics and a little bit about who settled them. And we're not going to go too deep into it because the book itself really fleshes out not only how they were, like it shows the entire etymology. Who were the settlers that created that particular cultural, nationhood feeling? And what was their path of growth? And why do they cover the areas that they cover and all that stuff? And who were they at war with primarily? And why were they clashing? All of that the book really goes into, and I personally find it fascinating. But we're just going to give you a taste in this podcast because, of course, if we went through the entire thing, it would be probably a 5-part series, I would imagine.
He's a dense writer, and
Oh
he's a
my
really
goodness.
good writer.
Oh yeah, he's a historian and a journalist, and I've noticed that I love like the journalists when they write books, they're always so captivating in my opinion because they have this really dense way of delivering information because they've taught themselves to write a lot of information a very small amount of words and sentences, and he does that. Like just the denseness of the information is been very satisfying to my introverted thinking cognitive function. So anyway, I highly recommend getting the book and really getting a very fleshed out perspective on all of this. But we're just going to do kind of a bit of an overview.
We're going to put the link in the show notes right below the show. So just click on that link. It'll take you straight to the book.
Exactly. We'll also provide a map. There's a map that he has in the book itself, which partitions out all of the county lines in the United States in particular. And it shows, like, basically, I think effectively everything that is broken up in county based on, I'm not sure if it was voting. No, I think it's actually just specifically the counties and where these nations, what they occupy, not based on states as much as based on counties. And so we'll provide that map underneath this too, so you can get a visual as well. So let's start with Yankeedom. Yankeedom was founded on the shores of Massachusetts Bay by radical Calvinists as a new Zion, a religious utopia in the New England wilderness. From the outside, it was a culture that put great emphasis on education, local political control, and the pursuit of the greater good of the community, even if it required individual self-denial. Yankees have the greatest faith in the potential of government to improve people's lives, tending to see it as an extension of the citizenry and a vital bulwark against the schemes of grasping aristocrats, corporations, or outside powers. For more than 4 centuries, Yankees have sought to build a more perfect society here on Earth through social engineering, relatively extensive citizen involvement in the political process, and the aggressive assimilation of foreigners. Settled by stable, educated families, Yankeedom has always had a middle-class ethos and considerable respect for intellectual achievement. Its religious zeal has waned over time, but not its underlying drive to improve the world and set the moral and social values that scholars have sometimes described as secular Puritanism. So Yankee culture spread with its settlers across upper New York State, the northern strips of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, parts of the eastern Dakotas, and on up into Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and the Canadian Maritimes.
So that covers a lot of territory. When I think about Yankeedom, I think of Boston as the ground zero of Yankeedom culture. And when you're in Boston, I think you can definitely feel it there. I mean, you can see with all the Ivy League institutions in Massachusetts and their emphasis on education. The schoolhouse is kind of the focus. The schoolhouse and the church house are the focus of like the settlers of the New England colonies. And it feels like that's where life was centered around. Very educational heavy, very much reform the world through educating people into being better citizens is kind of the ethos that comes from this.
Yeah, and it felt very meritocracy oriented about hard work. It was less about, as we mentioned, government is what gets you away from the grasping aristocrats, corporations, and outside powers. Like if everybody is good, hardworking, honest folk, then you're going to have a stable society. And you want to get away from this idea of, an aristocracy of people who just kind of get to live off of other people. And because of that, Woodard mentions that they've been locked in an almost perpetual combat with the Deep South for control of the federal government since the moment such a thing existed. And so already this nation and the cultural influences behind it and the things that mean something to it start to create an animosity with other nations that have less of an insistence on this idea of everybody just being good, hardworking, honest folk that are, focused on education, and these other nations that wanted to build something like an aristocracy, then they start to lock horns. What I thought was interesting about going through all the chapters in Yankeedom is I could really recognize a story, like particularly around Thanksgiving, where you've got the story about the Puritans settled, and that's supposed to be the etymology for all, everybody who lives in North America for the most part. And I realized that one of the reasons why that's probably so locked into our collective unconscious in the United States, and I got that story served to me too, even though I lived on the West Coast, right? That's not necessarily my people, but that concept of the Puritans settling is in all of the school books. And of course, it makes sense that the school books would be written by people in Yankeedom because they were the ones who were so focused on education. And so in some ways, the etymology story of, who settled the United States has been a little bit, cast over by the Puritan story, even though going through like sort of my history and going through all these different nations, I realized my people are actually from El Norte. And El Norte was settled before the Puritans came. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But it was like, yeah, I guess that's probably true. Not everybody was settled by Puritans in Massachusetts Bay, were they? And so that focus on education has certainly given Yankeedom an advantage in being able to help control the narrative of the United States.
Yeah. Also, if you think about the extension of the education system into colleges and universities across the country, and the schoolhouses across the country, across North America, really. If you think about the influence that Yankeedom has, there's a lot of sensibilities of this idea of social engineering, a new world, through education. You see like protests on college campuses and all these crazy battles that are happening at the campus level. And then people that don't agree with that whole philosophy call them elites, the overeducated elites. And you could see this already starting to form a wedge with people to say, that phrase, damn Yankees kind of thing comes to mind. This idea of like Yankees are kind of forcing their will upon us. They're trying to, quote unquote, educate us into being better people through forcing these social engineering, ways of being through the education system. So you can already see this First Nation, not the First Nation, this nation we're talking about first, as some of the already setting us up for conflict. We haven't gotten to the other nations yet. But you can already see a certain viewpoint that Yankees bring that not everybody resonates with, right? So this is already starting to form. The other key point about Yankeedom is it does not favor or even value individual liberty or freedom as much as it favors and values collective freedom and liberty. So it's all about the community itself being free at the expense of the individual, not the individual being free. So this is a very key concept because in America, if you grew up here in the history books, there's a lot of emphasis put on to individual freedom and liberty, but that is not a Yankee sentiment.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And I think, especially as we go into some of these nations that are very individualistic and push away concepts of government and are all about the individual liberties and freedoms, you could see how those nations would be clashing with each other, and particularly in places like voting booths. So the second nation that we'll talk about is called New Netherland. And while short-lived, the 17th century Dutch colony of New Netherland had a lasting impact on the continent's development by laying down the cultural DNA for what is now Greater New York City. Modeled on its Dutch namesake, New Amsterdam was from the start a global commercial trading society, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, speculative, materialistic, mercantile, and free trading. A raucous, not entirely democratic city-state where no one ethnic or religious group has ever truly been in charge. New Netherland also nurtured two Dutch innovations considered subversive by most other European states at the time, a profound tolerance of diversity, and an unflinching commitment to the freedom of inquiry. Forced on the other nations at the Constitutional Convention, these ideals have been passed down to us as the Bill of Rights. Despite the defeat of the Dutch by the English in 1664, New Netherland has retained its fundamental values and societal model, having long ago replaced Amsterdam as a leading world center of Western commerce, finance, and publishing. Its territory has shrunk over the centuries, its southern reaches, Delaware and southern New Jersey, absorbed by the Midlands, its northern ones, Albany and the upper Hudson Valley, by Yankeedom. Today it comprises the 5 boroughs of New York City, the lower Hudson Valley, northern New Jersey, western Long Island, and southwestern Connecticut, where Red Sox fans are outnumbered by Yankee fans. As a center of global commerce, New Netherlands has long been the front door for immigrants who've made it the most densely populated part of North America. Its population, 19 million at the time of the book's writing, is greater than that of many European nations, and its influence over this continent's media, publishing, fashion, and intellectual and economic life is hard to overstate.
So if the Yankeedom area is the the starting point of the intellectual or I guess the educational element, you can see New Amsterdam or the greater New York City area as the trading starting point. So this is where all the commerce is coming through. And obviously New York City today is the center point of media and commerce. And it's very interesting that New Amsterdam, the Dutch settled this, and already there's a narrative emerging here. The story that you're told in American schools, at least when I was a kid, and maybe it's changed since then, but the story you're told is that the Puritans that settled New England fled Europe because of religious persecution. Now, there's some truth to that. There was some religious persecution happening, but actually what happened, a lot of these Puritans were in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam was a very free society. And they came to the New England area because they wanted to have actually more rigid rules and more structures on how they were going to live their lives. Now, there's some conflicting stories about how this happened, but you can already see a narrative emerging where these two nations, New Amsterdam here in the United States, the greater New York City area, and Yankeedom, already have some differences of opinion in how they see things. New York wants to be very free. New Netherlands wants to be very free, wants to be very commerce focused. They're cool with having tons and tons of diversity in how they behave. And Yankeedom's got a little different spin on this. They're a little more homogenized in how they see things, a little more community focused. They don't really like big business as much. They want the community and the local people to democratically vote on things moving forward.
Well, I think Yankeedom was fine with a bit of diversity in like sort of an ethnic or racial way, but they definitely wanted you to assimilate to their way of life. So it was more about cultural homogenization as opposed to ethnic or racial.
Correct.
Whereas New Netherland couldn't really, they didn't care about your ethnicity or your race. And they didn't really care if you assimilated, but you were in their town now. And this town was built on commerce. So if you're going to stay there, you're going to also have to, you're going to have to honor that this is a commercial place. And so there's actually, in some ways, more things like racism in New Amsterdam as opposed to Yankeedom, because Yankeedom didn't care as much about, your race. But there is a lot more multiculturalism in New Amsterdam because New Amsterdam didn't require you to hand your cultural diversity over to them. They didn't require as much assimilation. But that doesn't mean that a culture wasn't still very strong. And it doesn't mean that people didn't also assimilate into that culture. They just were allowed to bring more of sort of the culture of the homeland or the motherland or whatever with them as they came. So that is kind of an interesting sort of little nuance in the differences between the two. And I think what's interesting about this concept of New Netherlands, or really New York City, is that it's a tiny little patch on the map, right? And we know this about New York. It's a tiny little patch on the map compared to all the other cultures because it never spread west. A lot of these other cultures and nations we'll talk about are like bands that run across the United States and over through Canada because it spread west. But New Netherlands didn't. It really just stayed in New York. And despite that, it is still an extremely powerfully influential culture in North America. In fact, I would argue in the world. The culture of New York is very influential all over the planet. And so it's fascinating how something so small could have so much influence. But of course, a lot of writing, right? A lot of publishing happens in New York. A lot of media exports happen from New York. And so its reach is vast. So let's move on to the Midlands, arguably the most American, quote unquote, of the nations. The Midlands was founded by English Quakers who welcomed people of many nations and creeds to their utopian colonies on the shores of Delaware Bay. Pluralistic and organized around the middle class, the Midlands spawned the culture of Middle America and the Heartland, where ethnic and ideological purity have never been a priority. Government has been seen as an unwelcome intrusion, and political opinion has been moderate, even apathetic. The only part of British North America to have a non-British majority in 1775, the Midlands has long been an ethnic mosaic, with people of German descent, not Anglo-Saxons, comprising the largest group since the 1600s. Like Yankees, the Midlanders believe society should be organized to benefit ordinary people, but they are extremely skeptical of top-down governmental intervention, as many of their ancestors fled from European tyrannies. The Midlands is home to a dialect long considered standard American, a bellwether for national political attitudes, and the key swing vote in every national debate from the abolition of slavery to the 2008 presidential contest. From its cultural hearth in southeastern Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, and northern Delaware and Maryland, Midland culture spread through much of the heartland, central Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, northern Missouri, most of Iowa, and the less arid eastern halves of South Dakota, Nebraska, and Kansas. It shares the key quote-unquote border cities of Chicago with the Yankees and St. Louis with Greater Appalachia. It also has an important extension in southern Ontario, where many Midlanders emigrated after the American Revolution, forming the central core of English-speaking Canada. While less cognizant of its national identity, the Midlands is nonetheless an enormously influential moderating force in continental politics, as it agrees with only part of each of its neighbors' strident agendas.
So what's interesting about the Midlands, like the book talks about, is it wasn't just settled by English descendants. A lot of German influence was here in Pennsylvania. Now, we're recording this right now from our studio in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So that's really where we're located, right in the heartland, or heartbeat of the Midlands. Now, a little further to our east in Philadelphia is where it got its start. Kind of a Quaker, very, like Antonia mentioned or got from the book, it's very much this middle-class organized mosaic of people. And what's interesting is if you come to this area where we're at here in Gettysburg and you go around, there's a lot of towns named after German cities or German areas over in Europe, right? And then you've got a lot of German food, a lot of German influence through here. And those people groups were here. In fact, the Amish people that live here in central and eastern Pennsylvania still speak a dialect of German that has evolved over the years. It's not exactly how Germans speak, but it's a dialect of German that they actually speak with each other still to this day. Fascinating cultures, very interesting experience when you visit this part of Pennsylvania. And then, like Antonia mentioned, it extends also west to the center part of those states, Indiana, Illinois, all the way west.
Yeah, and later in the book, Woodard talks about how the people who settled here wanted to do it for the long haul. They wanted to form roots. They were very respectful because there were a lot of farmers and agriculture was very important. They were very respectful of the land. They wanted to make sure that they had cultivated it in a way where they could pass these farms that they worked on to their children and their children's children. And there's just like this real sort of down-earth, down-homey feel about people in the Midlands. And they tend to be rather quiet. And I've noticed that my energy, my left coast, El Norte, far west energy, which we'll talk about those in a moment, can be almost a little disruptive to people in the Midlands. It's like they're quiet, they keep to themselves, and you can tell that they just want to have a little bit of peace in their life. And I thought it was fascinating, the idea that they had fled from European tyrannies. And so because of that, they're skeptical of government. They're skeptical of government getting in their business, but at the same time, they also have this sense of, wanting to take care of community. Like government should be set up to benefit not individuals, but to the common man. The common man is a very important part of the Midlands, but there's nothing that they necessarily all fully agree on. As mentioned, they sort of agree with a little bit of everyone. And so because of that, and this is very Quaker of them, actually, the Quakers were they were pacifists and they kind of wanted to stay out of a lot of the squabbles of the past. And so you've got that sort of peaceful Quaker, sort of quiet, put your roots, deep and don't make too much of a fuss. And what are the issues? And as they come, then we'll decide, which ends up giving them an enormous amount of power in presidential and other, federal elections, because they end up, as mentioned, creating or becoming all the swing states. And so the Midlands, interestingly enough, even though they're kind of an unassuming people, they end up having an extraordinary amount of influence in the entire United States.
So before we move on from the Midlands, I'll just make a note here. We're here in Pennsylvania, and one of the nations of my extended family are Midlanders. And so this is already a narrative that I've been constructing to understand my family more and some of the schisms that have happened. There's a segment of my extended family that identifies very strong. Several live in Ohio, some live here in eastern Pennsylvania, and some live just over on the western side, but they're still in the Midland area. They identify with that nation. So that's a really interesting, it's starting to evolve a narrative for me understanding my family much better.
All right, let's move on to Tidewater, the most powerful nation during the colonial period and the early republic. Has always been a fundamentally conservative region with a high value placed on respect for authority and tradition and very little on equality or public participation in politics. Such attitudes are not surprising given that it was founded by the younger sons of Southern English gentry who aimed to reproduce the semi-feudal manorial society of the English countryside, where economic, political, and social affairs were run by and for landed aristocrats. These self-identified cavaliers largely succeeded in their aims, turning the lowlands of Virginia, Maryland, southern Delaware, and northeastern North Carolina into a country gentleman's paradise, with indentured servants and later slaves taking the part of the peasants. Tidewater elites played a central role in the foundation of the United States and were responsible for many of the aristocratic inflections in the Constitution, including the Electoral College and state, whose members were to be appointed by legislators, not chosen by the electorate. But the region's power waned in the 1830s and 1840s, its elite generally following the lead of the planters of the ascendant Deep South in matters of national political importance. Today, it's a nation in decline, rapidly losing its influence, cultural cohesion, and territory to its Midland neighbors. Its undoing was a matter of geography. It was blocked by rivals from expanding over the Appalachian Mountains.
So I actually lived in the Tidewater area when I lived in Baltimore for many years. And it's very interesting, the cultural difference. And it's only, from where we are right now, a 90-minute drive. And you can definitely see you switch nations when you drive across the Mason-Dixon line into Maryland and then down into the Virginia area, Norfolk, Washington, D.C., all the area of, the power of government and all that for the United States, the federal government. And this whole Tidewater area was really the staging ground for the American Civil War in the 1860s. Now, it happened other places too. It happened a little further north up here in Gettysburg, for example, and even further in the south. But there was a lot of fighting that happened in this Tidewater region. And what's interesting about Tidewater is it was settled by a lot of the Jeffersons and the Madisons and, the quote-unquote founding fathers that we think about when we think about the founding fathers of the United States. And these are the people that had a lot of narrative carried forward in how they founded this country. A lot of the documents were written by Tidewater people. Jefferson was one of the main architects, Thomas Jefferson, one of the main architects of the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of the thinking that came from this region, like Antonia mentioned, the Electoral College, other things like this, there's some, came from this area. There's some legacy here that's so interesting to me. I remember when I lived in Baltimore, in Maryland, they have this notion of what's called ground rent, meaning that if you own your house, you may not own the land below your house. It's a very landlord kind of feudal system, Old English way of doing things, right? I don't know exactly how the law works. I didn't research it down to the nitty gritty of it. But basically, someone can own the land under a house and someone else can own the house on top of it. And this is that kind of aristocratic, feudal system almost that was installed here in the Tidewater region. And they still have this today. It's so weird when I'm down there. I'm like, what? You have ground rent? That is so bizarre to me.
Well, and I don't think they still do fox hunting because I doubt fox hunting is legal. But there's like this concept of sort of like I remember going to a hotel that, actually we stayed there a couple times that had a very sort of like fox hunting theme. And, very, like you mentioned, it's kind of like an Old English feeling. And that makes sense because in the chapter where he talks about Tidewater, in England at the time, there was a saying that you take a litter of puppies, you take the oldest one, you nurture, feed them, and then you drown the rest. And that was the feeling aristocrats had about their children. You had kids, you made sure the older one, the older son was taken care of, but then the rest of them were just backup systems, basically. And they didn't get any rights for the most part. So these second sons were looking for a place to land and recreate that sense of gentry. And they did, and they were very successful at it. Their plantations were basically gentlemen's paradises, and so they created a very influential time period early on in the United States because they were so successful at what they did. But as mentioned, it's a nation in decline. That those concepts and those values and that feeling never really took root because it couldn't get its way over the Appalachian Mountains. It couldn't go west. And so again, a lot of these nations, if you look at the map, they have these bands that travel west but Tidewater doesn't. It stays stuck right where it is. And because of the Appalachias, but not just because of the Appalachian Mountains, but because of the nation of Greater Appalachia, actually, is what truly hemmed them in. So we should probably go to that. Do you have anything more to say about Tidewater?
No, I think that's good.
All right, so we're going to talk about Greater Appalachia, which it's always one of my favorite chapters to read, is anything on Greater Appalachia. Greater Appalachia was founded in the early 18th century by wave upon wave of rough, bellicose settlers from the war-ravaged borderlands of Northern Ireland, Northern England, and the Scottish lowlands. Lampooned by writers, journalists, filmmakers, and television producers as rednecks, hillbillies, crackers, and white trash, these clannish Scots-Irish, Scots, and North English frontiersmen spread across the Highland South and on into the southern tiers of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, the Arkansas and Missouri Ozarks, the eastern two-thirds of Oklahoma, and the hill country of Texas, clashing with Indians, Mexicans, and Yankees as they migrated. In the British Isles, this culture had formed in a state of near constant war and upheaval, fostering a warrior ethic and a deep commitment to individual liberty and personal sovereignty. Intensely suspicious of aristocrats and social reformers alike, these American borderlanders despised Yankee teachers, Tidewater lords, and deep Southern aristocrats. In the Civil War, much of the region fought for the Union, with secession movements in Western Virginia, creating West Virginia, Eastern Tennessee, and Northern Alabama. During Reconstruction, the region resisted the Yankee effort to liberate African slaves, driving it into a lasting alliance with its former enemies, the overlords of the Tidewater and deep southern lowlands of Dixie. The Borderlanders' combative culture has provided a large proportion of the nation's military, from officers like Andrew Jackson, Davy Crockett, and Douglas MacArthur to the enlisted men fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. They also gave the continent bluegrass and country music, stock car racing, and evangelical fundamentalism. Greater Appalachia's people have long had a poor awareness of their cultural origins. One scholar of the Scots-Irish has called them the people with no name. When U.S. Census takers ask Appalachian people what their nationality or ethnicity is, they almost always answer American or even Native American.
Well, and this would be the Cherokee Nation. It was a Native American nation, was all through the Appalachian Mountains here in the United States. And so I think a lot of the reason why they identify with Native American, there's a lot of intermarrying that happened when they first came over from Scotland and Ireland, these hill countries over into the hill country here in the United States. And there was a lot of intermating that happened. And so I think a lot of their identity is actually Native American.
Yeah, well, and what's so fascinating to me about Greater Appalachia, and he usually just refers to them as Borderlanders, referencing, of course, where they came from in the British Isles as like a pretty rough area of almost constant warfare. What's fascinating about these Borderlanders is that on some levels, they very much enjoyed Native Americans. They ended up taking Native American wives and having Native American children, or what they would call half-breeds at the time. And at the same time, there was still this sense of sort of superiority. And so portions of them felt like that was wrong and that they should keep, the superiority of the white person. And then a lot of them, though, they were frontiersmen. And so being part of these cultures and the Cherokee and Native American cultures was kind of, that was like a really, that was like a part of the frontiersman life. And so on some levels, they identified with people who just wanted freedom. He mentions in the chapters about them that they would keep moving west as the federal government expanded its reach and would take over sort of areas that they were in. They would just keep pushing west. And because they were trying to get out of the federal government's, reach. And as they continued to push west, though, that meant that they were now getting into territories where Native Americans were at, and then they would start taking them over or going to battle with them. And so on one level, they respected Native Americans. On another level, they just had no respect for them at all and would take over their land if they wanted it. And on one level, they hated the Deep South and slavery. And, well, I don't think they hated slavery so much as they just hated the aristocratic affectation of the Deep South. And they hated the Tidewater gentry because that made them feel sort of inferior. But at the same time, they ended up aligning with them simply because they hated Yankeedom even more. And so all of the chapters about Greater Appalachia are this, you can tell that they only know one thing, and that is that they want to be left alone. They just know that they want independence, and they're ready to fight for it at any moment, and they're ready to do whatever it takes to feel like they're a free people. And so they end up just sort of jumping loyalties, and they end up having like weird alliances that maybe even they aren't really super happy with, just as long as they don't have anybody lording it over them.
So you can see this in contrast to the very first nation we talked about, Yankeedom. The Borderlanders, or the Greater Appalachian people, are much more interested, almost compulsively so, to individual freedom and liberty. And if anyone messes with their individual freedom or liberty, there's going to be a fight. And so when they look north to Yankeedom, who is now coming to, quote unquote, tell the Deep South how to be, and tell Greater Appalachia how to be, and tell Tidewater how to be, they look at this as an aggressive move, even though there's not a lot of slaveholders in these areas. They look at this as an aggressive move on two fronts. One, they already have a distrust of the federal government. They want complete and total radical independence from a government they've been on the run from for a long time. They keep moving west, just out of the reach of the federal government. So Yankeedom's aligned with the federal government, who is in the eyes of the Borderlanders not to be trusted, and an entity you don't want meddling in your life. And then Yankeedom also brings with it this idea of social engineering and trying to re-educate you into the right way of thinking and behaving. And this is, again, against how Borderlander at Greater Appalachian people. They want individual freedom, individual rights, not community freedom and community rights. And so you can already see this narrative emerging here where, come around the 1860s during the time of the Civil War, the people through this region have to decide, are they going to align themselves with the Deep South, we're going to talk about in a little bit here, or are they going to align themselves with Yankeedom and the federal government? And obviously they chose to align themselves with Tidewater, the Deep South, and ended up having what is called in the book, and other historians have called this, the Dixie Coalition.
Yeah, and it's not an easy coalition though. There was not a lot of love for the Deep South, but they ended up, like you mentioned, aligning with them mostly because of their frustration around social engineering. And you can see these schisms today.
Oh yeah, in the last election.
It's like, to me, it's such a clear battle between Greater Appalachia sentiments and Yankee sentiments. It's fascinating. But what's really interesting too is that Midland part, because what separates Greater Appalachia and the band that moves west with Greater Appalachia and Yankeedom and the band that moves west with Yankeedom is that Midland band. And Midland's almost kind of like they sort of wrap around Greater Appalachia actually and go up. And you were talking about the family reunions and what are the challenges? Like why is there this schism of culture? Well, portions of your family are Midlanders, but portions of your family are Borderlanders.
That's right.
They're from Greater Appalachia. And in particular, there's a little chunk of southwestern Pennsylvania that's in Greater Appalachia territory. And you can tell that there's sort of like this border area between the two, because the parts of your family that live in that portion of Pennsylvania have sympathies going both directions, but it just kind of depends on who's got the more compelling argument. And in your family in particular, and the schism that is around family reunions and who's in a fight with who, it's almost always the Greater Appalachian Borderlanders that are kind of starting it.
They're feisty. And
they're fighting with each other. And the Midlanders just want to be left out of it. They're just like, don't tag me in any of your Facebook posts. I don't want to see any of this. The Midlanders are like, keep us out of it. But the Greater Appalachians, the Borderlanders, are kind of at each other's throats, and they're upset with each other, and they wounded each other's pride. And I mean, it's so fascinating to watch it. And then because the Midlanders won't get in the fray, then the Greater Appalachian parts of your family are upset with the Midlanders because they're not taking sides, and they should be taking sides. So it's really kind of fascinating to see your family as a microcosm of probably what's happening on a political level as well. that these Midlanders are not really kind of getting in the fray as much, and both the Yankeedom and Greater Appalachia are trying to pull them into the argument, and the Midlanders just kind of want to be left alone. But then they end up having the final word because they're the swing states. So just that alone was super fascinating to me.
Yeah, it is. It is weird to see, and there's some of my family that are Yankees. They're from middle of Michigan, so they have more of a Yankee sentiment. They just stopped coming around altogether. They just don't, because they don't live close. They just I think one of them comes because he lives kind of close, but they just are MIA, and they've been MIA for years. And it's also fascinating to see just how the different nations just don't blend well together. They just see things not politically or religiously different. It's almost like how they behave and how they move through the world is different. It's not even ideology. It's just a way of being. It's so weird and bizarre to watch. So let's move on to the next nation. It's Deep South.
All right, the Deep South. The Deep South was founded by Barbados slave lords as a West Indies-style slave society, a system so cruel and despotic that it shocked even its 17th century English contemporaries. For most of American history, the region has been the bastion of white supremacy, aristocratic privilege, and a version of classical republicanism modeled on the slave states of the ancient world, where democracy was a privilege of the few and enslavement the natural lot of the many. It remains the least democratic of the nations, a one-party entity where race remains the primary determinant of one's political affiliation. Beginning from its Charleston beachhead, the Deep South spread apartheid and authoritarianism across the southern lowlands, eventually encompassing most of South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, and Louisiana, western Tennessee, and the southeastern parts of North Carolina, Arkansas, and Texas. Its territorial ambitions in Latin America frustrated, in the 1860s, it dragged the Federation into a horrific war in an attempt to form its own nation-state, backed by reluctant allies in Tidewater and some corners of Appalachia. After successfully resisting a Yankee-led occupation, it became the center of the states' rights movement, racial segregation, and labor and environmental deregulation. It's also the wellspring of African-American culture, and 4 decades after it was forced to allow blacks to vote, it remains politically polarized on racial grounds. Having forged an uneasy Dixie coalition with Appalachia and Tidewater in the 1870s, the Deep South is locked in an epic battle with Yankeedom and its left coast and New Netherland allies for the future of the Federation.
So obviously the book has pretty much zero nice things to say about the Deep South at this point. It goes into some other areas, but because it was founded by Barbados slave holders, this was a very severe and extreme version of slavery that was founded in the southern United States. It has a lot of challenges. I mean, it has a history that it cannot escape that influences how politics and life in the Deep South are constructed and lived even to today. And it's been, I think, kind of like America, at least the United States here, America's original sin in a lot of ways. It's been the thing that's been a burden and something the United States has had to deal with, and I don't believe has even gotten halfway through the healing process around. I think we've got a lot of work to do in this country. And I think that the Deep South has made some progress, but I think there's a lot of progress to continue to be made.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I don't have a lot of familiarity with the Deep South in general. I've lived in quite a few places in the United States, but I've never lived in the Deep South. The closest is that you and I will snowbird to Florida, to Orlando for a couple months a year, and we used to do it in Jacksonville. So I would think spending some of my winters in Jacksonville is about as close to the Deep South as I've ever gotten. Jacksonville, Florida. And I wouldn't say that that's a particularly good representation of the entire Deep South. So I actually don't have a lot of familiarity. And I remember reading the book thinking, man, if I lived in the Deep South, I would probably be pretty offended by now. But at the same time, I can't deny that there is quite a bit of challenge that the Deep South still has along racial lines. And that makes sense. I think part of my confusion around why racism was such a huge issue was in part clarified by reading this book, thinking, well, the etymology is these slave lords that even at the time appeared to be almost inhumanely cruel. And so if those are your roots, how long does it take to heal from that kind of past? How long does it take? Like what kind of time period are we looking at that would be required to really truly heal from that sort of trauma? And so it gave me a greater understanding of what were the roots that started growing and what needs to be addressed if racism is going to be really tackled sort of head on. Like we can't deny what the point of origin was. And I don't think a lot of people would want to deny that necessarily. But one thing I did really, this is not necessarily specifically about the Deep South, but one thing that came to me as I was reading this book is an observation about the different stories or narratives around slavery in this country. I've heard narratives around, plantation owners kind of took care of their slaves, right? And they kind of almost treated them a little bit like family, all the way over to, no, they didn't. They were horrific and they did these terrible things and worked them to death. And I couldn't reconcile these two narratives. I thought maybe, writing history that's the privilege of the person who does the conquering, right? Whoever wins the war gets to write about the war. And so I thought, well, maybe this sort of softened perspective of slavery is just a story or a narrative that was told in order to retcon or rewrite history. But I think there's two very distinctive styles of slave culture in the United States. One was in Tidewater and the other one was in the Deep South. Tidewater started out with indentured servants. And even though they were not kind to their indentured servants, the indentured servants started out as being people from like their own countries, right? Like they were England's, they were English or they were from the British Isles. And so the indentured servants would hand themselves over to these plantation owners in Tidewater. And if they survived the 3 years of indentured servanthood, I think they got like 50 acres of land. And so the original relationship that Tidewater had was with people who were their own race. So they didn't have this like sort of naturally, they didn't have the same relationship to their indentured servants that the Deep South had as Barbados slave traders. And then when slaves became so abundant in the country, and these indentured servants, of course, every 3 years, they'd lose them, then Tidewater started adopting the practice of slavery, but they treated them very similarly to how they treated indentured servants, which is, of course, still was not good. It still wasn't great, but it wasn't on the level of cruelty that the Deep South had sort of a relationship with their slaves. And in fact, a lot of slave owners, even those, the few that were in Greater Appalachia, this concept or the etymology of the phrase sold down the river is when a slave from Greater Appalachia area or Tidewater area got sold to a Deep South, plantation owner. And that was considered way worse. And so these two narratives or these different narratives of slave owners might actually have its roots in not necessarily truth. I mean, to me, just the practice of slavery in general just sounds horrific to me. And it always is about the worst thing I can possibly think of. That could just be because I lead with extroverted intuition and the idea of being somebody's slave is like the worst thing I can think of. But I am not trying to indicate any sort of softening of the horror of slavery. But there might have been a different relationship that Tidewater had with their slaves than the Deep South did, which is why different narratives may have sprung up. And that was the first time I had an explanation for why we have these two narratives that are sometimes difficult to reconcile.
I think the point here, just in case somebody's listening, that random dude or woman that's listening that's like, aha, yeah, see, slavery wasn't that bad. That's not what we're saying at all. It's really very clear that none of this is okay. I think what we're trying to do and what we try to do in a lot of our conversations here on the air and even personally in our lives is bring more nuance and distinction around the narratives that are being cast, not to endorse them or not to let them off the hook, quote unquote, to be, well, that's not such a bad thing. That's not the point. The point is when you have good fidelity, when you can get distinctions and nuance around different narratives, I believe, I think Antonia does too, that it allows you to actually deal with the narratives that are. It allows you to deal with the way people are really thinking and not just lump. And this is what I think what I was trying to say earlier when I said that people lump, if they disagree with you, they might lump you into a nation group. Like, for example, I use the example of like Yankee lumping someone into the Deep South if they disagree with them fundamentally somehow. And the reason I said that is because of some of this. If we don't have a lot of nuance or distinctions around these things, then somebody that disagrees with us is just lumped in as the enemy. And then there's this big enemy that's this one giant entity that we don't have an understanding around. Okay, well, that person thinks about it this way. It's still not good, but it's a little different than the person over here thinking about this. So I think that's the reason why we highlighted. I gave that example earlier, and then Antonia's giving the example here about the distinctions around slavery. Again, I want to be very clear. We are not saying any of this is okay or even indicating that at all. We're just trying to give some nuance around the narrative.
Yeah, well, and I think it's kind of like with all typologies. When you understand how somebody's wired, you have an easier time of communicating with them and talking to them and having productive conversations. And so having an understanding of how some of these nations, quote unquote, like the people who are born and raised in some of these cultures, really understanding the wiring of these nations, I think the best way to use it is to have dialogue, to have helpful dialogue of understanding that somebody else might be influenced to be wired in a different way than you are. And when you can have a helpful conversation with them to understand where they're coming from, then you can, you're so much more likely to be persuasive. You're so much more likely to understand why they think what they're thinking and have ideas that aren't cut off, right? Ideas need to be processed. We had a conversation about this. This is a little bit of a tangent, but you and I had a conversation about this, Joel, that ideas need to be processed like emotions need to be processed. If you've got a deep, strong emotion and you don't let yourself feel it, a low-grade version of it can live inside of you forever if you aren't able to fully process it out. And my opinion is that thoughts are the same. A person has a thought, and it might not be a healthy one. It might be a really bad one, like racism or something to that effect. But if they're told they're not allowed to think it, and so they stop it before completing the thoughts, they can have a low-grade version of it living inside of them all the time. But if they're able to fully think about it, right, express it, articulate it, get to the conclusion of that thought, a lot of times, just like with an emotion, it's like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm done with that one. Like you processed the full thought, you took it to its conclusion, you recognize, maybe that's not a good idea. And now a low-grade version doesn't have to be living inside you all the time. It's done. You processed it. And I think having conversations with people coming from different nations and different cultures, being able to communicate with them, not in a way that says, you're not allowed to think that thought, so you have to stop it right now, which actually never works, just like with emotions, that never works. Being able to have the conversation and not get triggered, not get upset by what the person is talking about, but just sit with it and hear it out and understand that they have a different style of wiring, then maybe they can get to the conclusion of that thought and have processed it and no longer have a need for it. So to me, learning about all of these things, the most important component of it, the most important element is having the helpful dialogue where we can process our emotions and our thoughts with each other without getting triggered, without having to make wrongs or call each other names. Even if the person is representing not a great thought, right? Not all thoughts are that great. Just like not all emotions feel that good. Not all thoughts feel that good either. And also, we need to be able to communicate with each other in a way that allows us to process them through and get rid of the unhelpful ones. So yeah, this is not to sanction any terrible thoughts. Slavery is obviously a terrible thought, and it's not an attempt to sanction it, but it is an attempt to understand why people have different narratives around them. And when they talk about them in a way that doesn't resonate with you, well, maybe there's a reason why they're talking about it in that way. Maybe there's an etymology that makes them think that, and then you can sort of compare, contrast, and go, oh yeah, well, that's a possibility, and like, let's hold space for this thought, and then get to the end of it and go, maybe that one's not as helpful. So yeah, I think that's the primary reason why we try to create these distinctions and present models of diagnostics for how people think, so that we don't get so easily up in arms when somebody's not thinking like us.
I think the Deep South, along with El Norte, that we're going to talk about soon, in New France, are probably three of the nations I understand the least. I really don't. I've spent some time in the Deep South, not living there, but like you said, we go to Florida. I've spent a lot of time there, but I don't understand some of the culture. I thought it was very interesting from my standpoint, living in the Midlands, the border of Midlands and Greater Appalachia, driving to the Deep South, through the Deep South on I-95 to see my grandmother in Jacksonville as a little kid. I remember, my parents would talk about it as the Bible Belt, as this very Christian area, this very, very culturally American Christian. And I remember driving on 95 South as we crossed over into the Deep South from North Carolina into South Carolina and south of there, billboard after billboard for strip clubs and pornographic like places and alcohol advertisements. And I live in what would ostensibly not be the Bible Belt of the North. And I was a little kid very confused about this. Like, why in this area that proclaims something is there so much of this other stuff going on? And I realized the culture there is so much different than the Midland culture that I was used to, which was much more Midland and Yankeedom culture, which I was more used to, in the Northeast, which had much more of control around alcohol, control around sex. It was much more of a Puritan or Quaker or even pious German type influence, where you didn't have those kind of things where we were. They didn't sell alcohol in the grocery stores when I was. They still don't here in Pennsylvania. You can't get alcohol at like a grocery store. They're starting to have it like off to the side a little bit in like these special beer garden like restaurant places, but they don't sell them in gas stations, in our grocery stores or anything in the Midlands. So it was just such a bizarre experience going to the Deep South. I just don't understand it very well. It's very difficult for me to understand the Deep South.
Yeah, well, and I think in the book he mentions that the Deep South had, with the aristocracy of the Deep South, they had a little bit more of like a self-indulgent component. So that little bit of self-indulgence kind of peaks out. Whereas the Quakers, even though they were like chill and you live your life and I'll live my life, there's no self-indulgence around here. In fact, to a point where I'm like, how does anybody entertain themselves? I don't even know. And so, you can see, again, it's kind of that point of origin. What are the initial conditions of the system? And then the system springs up around it. And you can see those vestiges carrying on after, even hundreds of years.
So I think we should pause here and actually do a second podcast to finish the next, what have we done, like 6 of these nations so far?
Yeah, we've done 6.
So let's take a break here. Let's make this part 1. Let's do a part 2 next time so we can cover these. Because otherwise, it's going to be a really, really long podcast. And we can get into some more of the nuances of the next 5 nations on the next show.
Yeah, okay. That sounds like a good idea.
So if you've been listening along and you've got, maybe you've read this book, you have gotten yourself a copy. If you hadn't got yourself a copy, you should get a copy directly below this show. We want you to come on to personalityhacker.com and leave us a comment, share your story, some of the insights or questions you might have had from this conversation or the book. I think it would be a fantastic discussion to have around some of the things that are coming up for you as we discuss this. Love to hear your thoughts and your stories. The best place to do that, again, is to come over to personalityhacker.com directly below this show and leave a comment.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you're feeling particularly giving, you can leave us a rating review on iTunes. That helps us out a lot. And of course, our book is available on Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes & Noble, and your local bookstore. If they don't have a copy, ask them for one and they can special order it. And then you're supporting your local bookstore, which I think is awesome. So feel free to grab yourself a copy. And then once you've read it, if you would leave us a rating and review on Amazon, that would also help us out a lot.
So now you got 2 books you got to go get. You got to go to American Nations and Personality Hacker, right? We're making you go buy a bunch of books.
Then you can have a book obsession like Joel has.
Yeah, it's like I don't know, it's like college. You got to go buy all these books just to be part of it. But you should buy Personality Hacker first, and then you can get American Nations next. Because Personality Hacker, you're here listening with us. I think that's only fair.
Really, they should already have the Personality Hacker book, right?
That's true. So go leave a comment. Go leave a review.
And if you don't, you should feel shame.
Yes, absolutely.
We'll shame our audience into buying our book.
Did you do the whole spiel? Did you do the whole spiel about social media yet?
Yeah, I think I did.
Or do I usually do that?
You do the social media. I tell them to go subscribe on iTunes.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And various Android platforms.
That's right. So go get Personality Hackers a book and then get American Nations and come over to facebook.com/personality hacker. Join our community of like minds, people that think similar to you. They might be from a different nation than you, but they're still interested in personal growth, have some of the same values as you. So that would be a great place for you to come over. You can also follow us at twitter.com/personality hack, HACK.
All these calls to action.
I know, it's crazy,
this is
right?
Terrible marketing.
It's all good, though. Just go get the book. That's all I got to say. My name is Joe Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you when we finish this short series on American Nations on the next Personality Hacker podcast.